What a joy it is to be back in Mabank, and certainly our association has been one of many years, and I am grateful for the association that we've had, for the bond and tie of love that binds us together, and we are certainly thankful for everyone's presence here this evening, and I'm thankful for the 33 years that the annual Mabank Lectureships have been held. Thankful for all the good work that has been done, and concerning the church here at Mabank, I can't help but think about what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica of hope. And I believe that adequately describes the Mabank congregation. Your work of faith, your labor in love, and the patience of hope which is ours and which you have displayed, not only through the lectureship for 33 years, but also for as long as I've been in this area. The Mabank congregation has been a beacon for truth, and so I admire and hold you up very highly in that regard. I thank you all for the invitation. Thank you for your presence here this evening. I've been allowed to make one announcement, and I would just as soon preach as make announcements, but that just seems to be the inevitable job of preaching. But I'd like to make this opportunity aware of this opportunity. This coming Friday night, May the 3rd, at the West Hill Church of Christ in Corsicana, they're having a Senior Saints meeting. I don't know exactly what they call that, but here it's advertised as the Senior Spring Seminar, and yours truly has been invited to come speak to them. I'll speak 2 times Friday night, and we will start our series of lessons at 6:30, and then about 7:15 we'll have a time of refreshments and visiting, and that's always a good time, and then we'll gather together again at 7:45, and we'll have our last study for that evening, and it will be based on really the theme is God is my rock. And so encourage you, if you have the opportunity, please turn out. You'll be welcome. And been able to do this one time before, and it was an absolute joy to be with all of those good folks at West Hill in Corsicana. For those of you who may be wondering, we are in the building, and been in there 2 weeks, and still not completely done in the sense of little things that they've got to complete, but we are in the building, and for that we are extremely grateful. And after being disposed from the building for 15 months, I quickly fell in love with the church pew. Found ours. I kind of got on it and rooted around a little bit. Then I bowed down to it, and it was a much needed thing for many of our folks. We've been sitting on cafeteria chairs for 6 months, and then we've been sitting in straight back black chairs that are pretty good for about 20 minutes, and then it's time to go. Anyway, we are blessed to be back in the building, and invite y'all to come visit us anytime you have the opportunity. Old and new. I'm a very simple fella. I used to kind of try to keep that under wraps, but now I sort of just put it out there in display. I'm very simple. I found a pair of shoes that I liked, dress shoes. I found a pair of cowboy boots that I liked. A brand. I like Twisted X Western boots. So anytime I'm going to go buy boots, which isn't very often, that's the brand I look for. But speaking of dress shoes, years ago I found a pair of Dockers dress shoes, and the style name was Trustee. And I've been wearing those things for I don't know how long, and so I finally decided it's time to get another pair. You know, when you don't wear them but 1 or 2 days a week, it takes a long while to wear out those dress shoes. But I found a pair, and the good wife ordered them for me, and they were delivered right to the house. Same style, same color, same size, and I put them on, and last night and warm around the house because I wanted to kind of get them broke in. But then I went and compared the new and the old. And I didn't know how wore out the old were. Now these I'm currently wearing are not as comfortable yet as those old ones were. But I thought to myself, and if I'd have had this in mind several months ago, I'd have been preparing a slideshow and I'd have had one old shoe and one new shoe on, and we could have really sort of accentuated this with the PowerPoint presentation, but I didn't think about it until it was too late. But old and new, and we understand the simplicity, but then we also need to capture the power behind that idea of old and new. And my subject tonight is to deal with the old and the new sacrifices. And as Brother Bob brought up, this is a very important aspect of our relationship with God, and not just us under the New Testament era of time, but you go all the way back and sacrifice has been offered. We'll look at the first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus as you find them there on your outline, but sacrifice even precedes that. If Job is the oldest writer, and you go to Job chapter 1, and you don't read very far into that chapter till you see where the children of Job, they've been at a party. Some think it's a birthday party, a time of celebration. Following that, now Job goes and offers sacrifices for his children lest they have sinned. So now we know when you talk about sacrifice, 3 things must be in place. You have to have an offering, an offerer, and in the case once the Levitical system is in place, we have a priest. And then now as we think about Christ, He is the ultimate sacrifice, serving as our high priest, prophet, priest, and king. Hebrews 1 through 3. We are a kingdom of priests. So now as we think about the 3 things that are needed for sacrifice, you have to have an offering, an offerer, and someone in the position to offer it. Under the patriarchal system, it would have been, as we think from Job, the heads of the houses, the fathers. They would offer those sacrifices on behalf of their family members. Now, think about Genesis chapter 8. As Noah is getting ready to leave the ark in Genesis 8 and verse 20, the Bible says, then Noah built an altar to the Lord. And he took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings to the Lord. Genesis 8 and verse 20. Genesis 22, verse 2. Story of Abraham and Isaac. And now we see where Isaac or Abraham is commanded by God to take now your son, your only son, whom you love. Now think about this. Take your son. That in itself conveys a lot of things. We love our children dearly. And now here Abraham is told, take your son, your only son, and the one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Abraham, we know, as we are familiar with the entire story, Abraham obeyed. And the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 that it was by faith that Abraham received him back as if he was already what? Dead. So in Abraham's mind, he had already sacrificed his only son. Now, we know what God provided. God provided a ram that had got caught in a thicket. So now He did provide the sacrifice, but Abraham had already offered his only son as a sacrifice in his mind unto God. And if God had not stayed Abraham's hand, what would Abraham have done? He would have offered his son as God commanded. We talk about sacrifice, we fast forward years. And we go to Exodus chapter 10. We're now in a context wherein Moses is in the series of episodes where he's trying to convince Pharaoh to let my children go, to let God's children go. And we come to Exodus 10 and verse 25. 24 now, Exodus 10, 24. Moses is stressing the fact that we've got to take our animals with us. We're not going to leave any animal here. We've got to go and worship. But in Exodus 10, 25, the Bible reads, "But Moses said, you must also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings that we may sacrifice to the Lord." So now here we have the idea of sacrifices being offered. Once again, Exodus chapter 20, verse 24. "An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you." And notice as well, Exodus 24, 5. "Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord." So now what I've read thus far is coming into the patriarchal period of time, and then also addressing it during the Mosaical period of time, in the early part of that, wherein sacrifices are being offered. So it's not just when we pick up in Leviticus 1 that now we see the offering of sacrifices, even though Leviticus 1 through 7, and then when you start looking at the book of Leviticus, you're going to see where these sacrifices are offered again and again and again and again, and they're told how to do them, why they ought to do them. Now, what is the thrust of the book of Leviticus? Why are all these sacrifices being stressed? Because the book of Leviticus is addressing a group, an unholy people, and is identifying for them how an unholy group of people can approach whom? A holy God. So it's not just what they offer, but more importantly, it's how they offer that. How they offer the burnt offering, the guilt offering, the sin offering, the thanksgiving, the peace offerings. All of those offerings, they could not just mindlessly go and offer those sacrifices. So when we talk about sacrifice and we talk about reviewing the Old Testament sacrifices, it took place in the patriarchal age. It took place throughout the Mosaical period of time. And let's go to Leviticus chapter 1. You have your Bible, so we'll go there and we'll begin to notice briefly. We don't have the time that it would take to just expound everything we'd like to say about all of these offerings, but I want you to just notice that sacrifice has always been a part of man's relationship with God. Now, we didn't even mention Adam and Eve. We could go all the way back. And where do you think those clothes came from that God put upon Adam and Eve? He put on them animal skins, did he not? Well, most commentators think that what did he do with the animals? He offered them sacrificially. On behalf of whom? Adam and Eve. Sacrifice. It is extremely important. But notice now, Leviticus 1, the burnt offering. This runs from Leviticus chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, and then it's picked up again in chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. Now the burnt offering, as it is presented to us here, and we'll begin our looking at the context in verse number 2, the very end of that context, and it says, "Now when you bring an offering of the livestock of the herd and of the flock, if his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord." So now this animal is going to be offered. It's going to be a burnt offering, and it is going to be offered unto God. And when you look down at verse number 13, it is a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, in those intervening verses in between 3 through 13, we're going to see where they're told how to offer it, how it is to be performed, what is to be done. And so we had the command to offer the sacrifice, but then there also had to be the obedience in terms to how that sacrifice was offered. Now, the second offering is the grain offering. The grain or the cereal or the meal offering, and this runs from Leviticus chapter 2, the first 16 verses, and you jump over to chapter 6, verses 14 through 23, and we have the cereal or the grain offering. Now what is important in this is, as I look at the grain offering, in verse number 1 says, when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour on it oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons. Now notice, God now makes provision. Now we see when you come to the burnt offering, it could be of the herd or it could be of the flock. So it could be a bullock or it could be also a lamb. We come to the meal offering. Now notice the various ways in which this meal offering could be presented. Verse number 4, if you have it and it's baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. But notice as well, but if your offering is a grain offering baked in a pan. Different ways of offering and presenting it. If you're baking it in an oven, then this is how you bake it. If you bake it in a pan, it shall be a fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. And you shall break it in pieces, pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering baked in a covered pan. However you choose to make this particular offering unto God, God provides various ways in which that can be done, but the reason that it has to be observed, notice once again, verse number 9, it is an offering made by fire, a what? A sweet aroma to the Lord. I think this is a key that we need to keep in mind on all of these animal sacrifices. Anybody ever burnt an animal? How sweet is that? The aroma of an animal just burning. Now, whenever you're looking, I'm not talking about on a barbecue pit, I'm not talking about that. That's a sweet smell, but you just have an animal out there that's dead and you come and pile those things up and burn them. That is not an aromatic scent. But now when you think about this being offered, the burnt offering and the grain offering, they're both identified as a sweet aroma. I suggest to you that it's not the offering itself, but what is the sweet aroma is how it's presented. That's what causes it to be sweet. Our third offering from the book of Leviticus is the peace offering. And this is found in chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. This is also found in chapter 7, 11 through 36. Now notice, if you will, the peace offering. It comes from the herd or the flock. It is a male or a female, but it must be without blemish. And it must be accompanied by a grain offering. And oftentimes is accompanied by that. And only certain parts were to be offered or presented by the priest. And so when we think about this peace offering, it is that which is emphasizing the relationship of peace that exists between God and man and man. It is a peace offering. And so as we think about this, there were three types. You go to chapter 7 where this is addressed as well. The sacrifice that is identified there, those three types. Number 1 was thanksgiving. We just offer up thanksgiving unto God. Secondly, though, there is the vow. You have made a vow and you're going to fulfill that vow. You've met that vow, so now, having done so, you offer the peace offering unto God. Or it can simply be a free will offering. I would have loved to have been in Jerusalem. I would love to go and to just observe how all of this sacrificing worked itself out. I've thought about this a lot of times. We would be students of the law, and so here I am, and I'm at the local market, and I'm buying something, and I see my good brother Bob for the third day in a row leading a lamb toward the temple. In my mind, what am I thinking? He has either done this, or this, because that's what that lamb would cover. So I would identify in my mind what Bob had committed as far as sin. But the only thing is, if Bob had been standing on that corner an hour earlier, he'd seen me leading the same type of sacrifice for the third day in a row as well. It was evident in what people were offering, what they were admitting they were guilty of and seeking God's forgiveness for in that sacrifice. And so it was a steady stream of people coming to the temple to offer sacrifices on behalf of their sinful relationship with God. I've oftentimes thought how good a cowboys those priests must have been. What happens to an animal when it smells blood? Eyes get wide, ears go back. They're looking for some place to go. And I just wonder how good of cowboys those priests had to have been. But notice as we continue along this line, thinking about sacrifice, now the sin offering, chapter 4, and this runs all the way through chapter 5 and verse number 13. And then picks up again in chapter 6, verses 24 through 30, the sin offering as it's found in Leviticus chapter 4. And there are specific situations that are addressed here. And I want you to notice with me that when you go through chapter 4, you're going to find these 4 things addressed. Unintentional sin. And you might just note Numbers 15:30. Because sins that were committed intentionally were not sins that were going to be forgiven. You think about Hebrews chapter 10. We are not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but we are to exhort one another all the more as we see the day approaching. But what's verse 26 say? If we sin willfully, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin. I cannot deliberately sin and then bring and seek God's petitions and seek God's forgiveness. I cannot continually, deliberately stay in sin and stay in good standing with God. Neither could they under the old covenant. Numbers 15:30 bears that out. But there is sins that were committed unintentionally. There were ways in which the animals were to be offered. And this resulted in the forgiveness of sin. The trespass offering, the sin offering, those things as we think about specific situations. Now, Leviticus chapter 5, trespass offering. 5:14 through 6:7, the trespass offering. These are things where people are involved and they are engaged in trespasses, and now they are to approach God in a way, and always this is done in such a way that it is to be a sweet aroma unto God. Now fast forwarding, I want us to think about Leviticus chapter 16 because of all the days in which sacrifice was offered. Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement had to be the day of all days. This might have been the very greatest day that the Hebrews enjoyed during the entire year. Now notice as well, when you go to Leviticus chapter 16, there is a phrase that is found predominantly in that entire chapter. And it is the word atonement. Atonement. Now we break that word down and it means what? At one-ment. Atonement is a term which we are able to be at one with God. And so now under that Old Testament system, that was available to them in the sense in which that sacrificial lamb was offered there on the day of atonement, and they were able to approach their God, and they had to have had a great relief placed upon them as that scapegoat was let go, gone out into the wilderness, and their sins were covered, their sins were atoned for, propitiation was a reality, and they were able to satisfy a God in heaven to whom they, like us, oftentimes had spent more time involved in sin than we would like to admit. So as we think about atonement, at-one-ment, but I want you to go back with me, if you would, very quickly, go back to Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4, because I think this is an important point, because it's not just the Day of Atonement where this is a reality. If you go to Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4, and it talks about the offering of the burnt sacrifice, then it says, "Then he, the offerer, shall put his head on the burnt offering, the offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make" what? Atonement for him. Folks, don't miss the point of sacrifice. The point of sacrifice is atonement. Now, under the old system, they had a whole different way of doing it. They had to offer those sacrifices, and the sad part about those sacrifices, as we now move to our second major point, the reality of those sacrifices is this: they were just preparatory. We'll get to that in just a moment. They were insufficient. We'll get to that in a moment. They were powerless. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Because now, quickly turn with me to Hebrews, the 10th chapter. Because now we're going to look at these Old Testament sacrifices, and we're going to look at those which we have been sort of discussing in a very brief and limited way as we think about the sacrificial system of the Old Testament and those numerous sacrifices that were offered. Now, this 10th chapter of the book of Hebrews points out several great things that we need to understand about that system. Notice, first of all, in the first 4 verses, the inadequacy of the animal system of sacrifice. In Hebrews 10 verse 4, what does it tell us? It was never intended that the blood of bulls and goats take away sin. That was never intended. And who understood the significance or who understood that point more than anyone? The offerer. It was an inadequate system. And it was never meant for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin, and that was recognized by the worshiper. Secondly, though, verses 5 through 10, sanctification is possible because of Christ Jesus, and this is realized by the worshiper. Notice verse 5, "Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God.' Previously saying, sacrifice and offering, burnt offerings and offerings for sin, you did not desire, nor had pleasure in them which are offered according to the law. Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first, that he may establish the second. And by that will, we," that's you and me, "by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." Jesus did not have to offer himself multiple times. He offered himself once. And when he got through, where did he sit down? At the right hand of God. So now as we think about the inadequacy of the animal system, then we have to see the overabounding adequacy of Christ's sacrifice, and that is realized by the worshiper. Now, verses 12 through 18, our sanctification is born of the offering of Jesus, and this gives us great reason to rejoice. Notice verses 11 and following. And every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. Let me ask you a question. Any of y'all song leaders ever get hung on the same song? Where they sing this song, this song. You can nearly put his songs up on the board. And you come in and you're thinking, oh, we're going to sing that again? I hope we'll think about that for just a moment. Because if Brother Jim led this list of songs last Sunday, and he comes in this Sunday, he may not be scheduled to lead singing. So he comes in, the scheduled song leader's not here. Well, what should he sing? He prepared last week for those, so why not sing those prepared songs again? After all, we're doing what? Worshiping God. And so now, as we think about accomplished song leaders and how grateful we are to have those song leaders, we need to be grateful for that, even if one does get sort of hung on the same song. One of our young men, we have the song books y'all have right there. We had never had what I call youth camp songs in the back of a song book. So one of our young men, he led the same song every time he led singing for a month. I started to kind of think, well, I'm tired of this song. But then I thought, if he wants to lead that song every Sunday for the next month, let him lead that song. And I need to be grateful that he's willing to do what? Stand up and lead singing. Well, now notice what he says here. It can never with those same sacrifices take away sins. You think if you lived under the old covenant, you would get tired of taking those same animals to the temple? Knowing that once you offer them, you've done the very best you can. But there is always a what? A remembrance of sin. It was insufficient system. Thirdly, though, as we look at Hebrews chapter 10, notice there is a new and living way that is presented. A new and living way that God has made available. And the response of the worshiper is to fulfill and come before the Lord boldly, verse 19, to have access through the new and living way, that is through Jesus, because we have a great high priest over the church in verse 21. There is an exhortation in verse number 22 of Hebrews chapter 10, and we are to draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. We are to be ready to come. We ought to have the attitude of the psalmist. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And we think about the sacrifice behind the blessing of us being able to come together and worship. It ought to never enter into the mind of a Christian, I'm going to stay home today. What have we done to the sacrifice of Jesus? We ought to be ready to come to worship. Second exhortation is found in verse 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. Folks, I've heard it a lot of times. Preacher, you need to quit dwelling on preaching on attendance. Don't be stressing attendance so much. And it seems like that always comes from those who need to be in attending. They need to be there, and yet they're the ones that are missing out. And so we think about this exhortation that we're given. We ought to be ready to come to a new and living way and to come to worship the God of heaven. Then finally we have the reaction of the worshiper, 26 through 31. Not sinning willfully, knowing there remains no more sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation. And anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy. Of how much sorer punishment do you suppose those who reject the Son of God count the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and do insult to the Spirit of grace. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, but recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partially while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. So we think about this encouragement. Let us not be of those who draw back to perdition, but let us be those who are living by faith. So we think about the review of the Old Testament sacrifices. It has always been a part of man to offer sacrifice to God so that he might obtain what? Atonement. Now, as we think about the response or the reality of those sacrifices, they were never able to satisfy completely. Therefore, we got to rejoice in the fact that Jesus offered himself once. And having offered himself once, he sat down at the right hand of God. But he opened a new way for us. Now, let's make application. In Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul writes concerning the church at Rome, and he tells them that they are not to be conformed to this world, but rather they are to be transformed by the renewing of their mind. They are to be those who are offering their bodies as living sacrifices. Folks, I want you to think for just a moment. Those dead animals, they didn't have any conscious choice. We do. Now I want to share with you just 6 things. What can we, as New Testament worshipers of God, offer in sacrifice? Let me mention these. Offer your body. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Offer your body as a living sacrifice. Offer your prayers. Revelation chapter 5 and verse number 8. Prayers of the saints are a sweet aroma that goes up to God. Offer your songs. What is the fruit of our lips? According to Hebrews 13 and verse number 15, it is a sweet sacrifice that is offered up unto God. Your good deeds. Notice, if you will, having your finger there perhaps still in Hebrews 13, notice verse 15, where we're talking about the fruit of our lips. Therefore, by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. Verse 16, though, but do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. The good deeds that we do not go unnoticed by whom? By God. Our contributions, our monetary contributions, they are to be those which are understood as that which is sacrificial in nature, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18. And then I want to notice this next thought with you, and this was presented by brother in the commentary. And go to Revelation 6:9, and I want you to just notice this particular thought. Because there might be some who would question the fact of the validity of this, and I would suggest to you that it may be open for discussion. But notice Revelation 6 and verse 9. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar signifying what? A place of sacrifice. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. Now we're going to track these saints under the altar all the way through the book of Revelation. They're mentioned multiple times. But could it be that as we offer our faithfulness unto God, as we offer our devotion to him and our service to him, that it is seen as that which is to be qualified as New Testament sacrifice? The Old Testament sacrifices were inadequate. But because of Jesus Christ and that new and living way that He has presented and made available to us, we can present as New Testament Christians the sacrifices of ourself unto God, and they will be a sweet aroma. Thank you so much for your attention.